I am honored to introduce Robert W. Mary to all of you. He is the author of 5 previous books, including President McKinley, Architect of the American Century, and A Country of Vast Designs, James K. Polk, The Mexican War, and the Conquest of the American Continent. He spent a decade covering Washington for the Wall Street Journal and served as an executive at Congressional Quarterly Incorporated for 22 years, including 12 years as CEO. He is also the former editor of the National Interest and the American Conservative. Tonight, he will be talking about his new book, Decade of Disunion: How Massachusetts and South Carolina Led the Way to Civil War, 1849 to 1861. In this sobering work of nonfiction, this book sheds light on one crisis over slavery that precipitated the splintering of the United States. Kirkus Reviews writes that Decade of Disunion is a sweeping and valuable history of the long prelude to the Civil War. Mary employs consistently thorough and crisp prose, combining his best attributes as a journalist and historian. Extraordinarily useful to readers no matter their level of familiarity with this particular period of American history. An essential volume for serious students of U.S. history, especially Civil War buffs. Everyone, let us all welcome Robert W. Mary.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Bernard, for that introduction. I appreciate it very much, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I see some familiar faces and some old friends and perhaps some new friends, so it's wonderful to have you here. I'm delighted to be talking about a decade of disunion for the simple reason that the decade of disunion was a long time in gestation. I first started thinking about this book about 20 years ago, and I like to say that I was minding my own business, just reading Paul Johnson's latest book of history, A History of the American People. And in that book, as he starts writing about the decade preceding the Civil War, he says, and I quote, "Only 2 states wanted a civil war, Massachusetts and South Carolina." That kind of jolted me. It was kind of like an offhanded observation, but it was kind of jolting. But I immediately began to think that if I ever did do that book on the 1850s, I would want to include these 2 states as a kind of a framework for bringing life to a story, to the broader narrative of the national effort to avoid people getting killed over this increasingly intractable slavery issue. So I began to research it, and I discovered that Paul Johnson wasn't exactly right. It was much more complex than that, and much more interesting, and I think much more revealing in terms of what was going on. So there was no question, however, that those 2 states were the vanguard states of both the North and the South. They were the states that led the sections as the drama increased over the course of the decade. An essential reality was that these states are not only very, very different in terms of their moral sensibilities, their attitudes about their cultural attitudes, why they came to America in the first place from England. They came from different places. They were hostile to each other. They were mutually hostile, mutually antagonistic. And I write in the book that had they not come to America in the 1600s, they probably would have been fighting each other in the English Civil War. So let's begin with Massachusetts. And if there's one thing to be said about Massachusetts politics at the beginning of this tale, of this narrative, it is that it was totally and utterly dominated by the Whig Party, as it had been dominated by the Federalists beforehand. And the Federalists were, of course, the forerunner to the Whigs when the Whigs were founded by Henry Clay in 1833. So what they stood for in the traditional sense was mostly economic issues. They fought with the Democrats over such things as high protective tariffs. The Whigs wanted them. The Democrats didn't. The Bank of the U.S., same thing. The federal public works projects, roads, bridges, canals, all designed as part of Henry Clay's American system, which were intended to build up America kind of from above, from the federal government. Again, the Democrats didn't like that. And I would say that the Whigs also were known for what I call a tacit opposition to slavery. And when I say tacit, it's because they didn't really intend to agitate against the South. And why not? Because that would be bad for business. Good for business was a steady flow of Southern cotton produced by slave labor into the burgeoning Massachusetts textile factories, where huge fortunes were being made, particularly after the advent of steam power, which was harnessed to run those factories. But now, by late 1849, December, when my narrative begins, the slavery issue agitating the country is becoming almost impossible to control. And the main reason was James K. Polk, one of my subjects of my biography, but James K. Polk's war with Mexico, which we won, of course, and which brought vast amounts of southwestern territory into the Union. And the question now agitating the country's politics, driving a wedge through the country, was, when those territories are carved up into states, are those states going to be slave or free? And just as it was driving a wedge through the country, it was driving a wedge through the Massachusetts Whig Party and the National Whig Party. It was breaking up into two factions. The first faction is what you might call the traditional Whigs. They soon were called the Cotton Whigs because while they opposed slavery, as I was saying, but they looked at it upon as a kind of an academic issue, not a call to action. So who's an example of a Cotton Whig? Well, Daniel Webster, who was a giant of his time, of course, and was eloquent in his opposition to slavery. But he also believed in what he called non-interference, meaning leave the South alone. The other faction of the split Whig Party in Massachusetts soon became known as the Conscience Whigs. And these were people who really hated slavery and despised the idea that America allowed it. And they wanted to put America on a course towards the elimination, the eradication of slavery entirely. And they knew that the first thing that they had to do, the first goal, was to make sure that there would be no slavery extension or expansion into those territories. So who's an example of the conscience Whigs? Well, one guy that I kind of like, who plays a role in the narrative, is Charles Francis Adams, son and grandson of presidents, John and John Quincy Adams. I don't have time to go into a lot about him, but I will say one thing that characterized him that I found fascinating was that he had a surging desire to live up to his family name and a persistent and gnawing feeling that he might not be able to measure up. And that motivated him a lot through his professional and his public life. But the big political question that now emerged in Massachusetts was, could the Whig Party, now split in two and not as powerful as it had been, could it retain the loyalty of men such as Charles Francis Adams, who had been loyal Whigs? And the answer was no. And the reason the answer was no was because of the rise, the emergence, I should say, of the Free Soil Party, which was anti-slavery and anti-slavery extension. So we now have Massachusetts, for years a solid Whig state, now grappling with three separate political factions that were attacking each other. Cotton Whigs, which I talked about, they're losing ground because they're increasingly viewed as unsound on the slavery issue. At the opposite pole is a group of people that I haven't mentioned yet, and these are the radical abolitionists. And I use that term without any pejorative intent because they played a major role, not just in Massachusetts, but nationally, in terms of agitating the slavery issue. And these are people who didn't care about, who weren't impressed with the idea that we're going to put slavery on a path to extinction. We wanted it to become extinct immediately, tomorrow. And who are these people? William Lloyd Garrison, the wonderful editor, founder and editor of the Liberator newspaper. And he had a couple of friends whose work was in the newspaper an awful lot. Wendell Phillips, a lawyer and peripatetic lecturer, and the Reverend Theodore Parker, and many, many others. And these people not only hated slavery, but they developed a feeling of despising the Constitution itself, because the Constitution was crafted and ratified with an understanding that slavery would be an ongoing institution. The view in that time, the prevailing view, was that slavery was going to move towards extinction on its own, and so it just needed to be managed in the meantime. But with that, those territories and that possibility of extension, all that came asunder. So Lloyd Garrison called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And these are people who were not opposed at all to dissolution of the Union. In fact, they favored it. They wanted to get rid of slavery by getting rid of the South. In the middle of between these two poles were the conscience Whigs and the Free Soil Party. And the two are beginning to merge now. And that's just a natural consequence of what was happening in terms of the slavery issue upending all the old structures. So conscience Whigs are becoming free soilers, and one of them is Charles Francis Adams. In 1848, he went to sort of scope things out. He went to the Free Soil National Political Convention in Buffalo, New York, where the convention nominated Martin Van Buren to carry the banner. Now, Martin Van Buren, as you know, had been a Democratic president. He'd been known as kind of sympathetic to Southern interests. But now he's a free soiler, and he's carrying the banner. And they selected for their vice presidential candidate none other than Charles Francis Adams. He had a good name, and they thought maybe he could bring a lot of people to his side. But to give you an idea of how marginal the Free Soilers were, in that election, Zachary Taylor, the winner, a Whig, garnered 1,361,000 votes, whereas Van Buren and Adams received 291,501 nationally. So it wasn't really on a surge. But there emerged in Massachusetts and in the Massachusetts Free Soil Party a fascinating character who I didn't know anything about. And I asked my friend David Shipman, who grew up in Massachusetts. David was a colleague of mine at the Wall Street Journal, and later was at the Boston Globe, and then the editor of the Pittsburgh paper. And I said, and he read my manuscript, and I said, did you know about Henry Wilson when you were growing up in Massachusetts? He said, I never heard of the man. But Henry Wilson is a fascinating character. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Henry Wilson by way of illustrating how I try to tell this story through people. He was born in 1812 into abject poverty in New Hampshire, and he was christened Jeremiah Jones Colbath. At age 10, with no economic prospects whatsoever, he became an indentured laborer on a large farm in New Hampshire. So for 10 years, he was in indentured servitude. At age 20, he was awarded 6 sheep and a yoke of oxen, and that's basically the only thing he had aside from food and lodging for his 10 years of labor. He sold them for $85. He walked 100 miles to Natick, Massachusetts. I was telling all this to my good friend from Massachusetts, Mark Shields, before he died. And he said to me, I was calling it Natick, Massachusetts. He said, that's very interesting, Bob, but it's pronounced Natick, so now I pronounce it Natick. So he went to Natick. He entered the shoemaking business as a apprentice. And to give you an idea of how much energy and intellectual energy he had, he once his apprenticeship was over, he started his own shoemaking business, and he built it up to a company with 100 employees and solid profits. He entered the state legislature still in his 20s, and now he's running the Free Soil Party. And if I could, I'd like to just read one little graph here that gives you an idea of where he's coming from. They called him the Natick shoemaker, reflecting his humble origins. It also reflected more subtly his improbable rise in a political milieu dominated by pedigreed figures with Harvard diplomas and tentacles of connection throughout Boston's rarefied high society. The dichotomy became vivid when Wilson suffered a political defeat, whereupon his followers blamed Charles Francis Adams and his allies for harboring aristocratic prejudices against such men as Wilson, while favoring their own well-born friends. And offended Adams denounced the allegations as tricks of demagogues to undermine better men, thus lending credence to the disparagement that Adams had sought to refute. So in 1851, Henry Wilson enters into a series of negotiations with the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party of Massachusetts had been in eclipse for years. In fact, it never did have any significant political standing in the state. And they were frustrated. But now they saw that the Whigs were sort of split up, and they weren't really cohesive anymore. Maybe this is a time when we can really go after them. But they thought it would be helpful if they could combine their force, whatever that was, with Henry Wilson's Free Soilers, pool their votes for the governorship, the senator, legislature, etc., and upend the Whigs. Now, Charles Francis Adams was aghast at this because he believed in what I call the politics of asceticism. He wanted everything to be pure, like he thought his father and grandfather were. And it wasn't very pure to be going around entering into alliances in which alliances in which the aim was simply vote getting. But for Henry Wilson, it all made sense because for him, politics was the art of power accumulation. And he understood that the accumulation of power depended upon the accumulation of votes. So the Dems wanted to take control of the state government and rewrite the state constitution because they wanted to upend the power of the old dying Whigs. And so they wanted the governorship, they wanted to get the legislature, they definitely wanted the Speaker of the House. And Henry Adams was fine with all that. He just wanted one thing. He wanted the Senate seat that Daniel Webster had just given up to become Secretary of State under Millard Fillmore. That was the third time he was Secretary of State, by the way. And Henry Wilson figured if I could get that Senate seat and I can install the right person in that Senate seat, we can really carry the anti-slavery battle for the people of Massachusetts and the people of the nation. And sure enough, he selected as his candidate Charles Sumner, later very, very famous and very pivotal in all of this. So now we've got to talk a little bit about Charles Sumner. So you see what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to tell this story through people, and I'm going to give you just a little smattering, just a little sampling of this. So Sumner was born in 1811, so he's about the same age as Wilson. He grew up in a joyless, austere home in which there was no mirth whatsoever. He was a product of the Boston Latin School and Harvard. He became a lawyer, but he wasn't really successful as a lawyer. He considered it the great grindstone, as he said, and he didn't really have the attention span to master the minutiae of a court case. But he was brilliant in the liberal arts and his mastery of the English language and his mastery of the literature and history of the classical period. So he could weave those into his speeches, and his speeches were marvelously erudite and very, very beautifully written. He was, as I say, brilliant in the liberal arts. He had no facility for math or science. I think that if we knew him today, we would probably say he's a bit on the spectrum. And another thing about him is that he had a tendency to become very nasty when he disagreed with somebody. He attacked not just the point of view of that person, but the person himself, not herself, because he never would act that way among women. In fact, he was extremely shy around women. He had one brief marriage, very unhappy. But he frequently lost his friendships because of that trait. But he was such an outgoing guy that he simply just made new friends. So it didn't really matter to him very much. But he was a reformer by temperament, whether it was prison reform or education initiatives or world peace or women's rights, and obsessively and passionately his anti-slavery sentiments. So he wins the Senate seat and goes to the Senate in December of 1851, and there's a lot of history that ensues out of that, which I won't have time to get into. And then Wilson moved on to something else that was maybe even more questionable from Charles Francis Adams' standpoint than what he did with the Democrats. He entered into an agreement with the Know Nothing movement. Now, the Know Nothing was a powerful backlash of nativist bigotry that emerged as a powerful force in the Northeast, Massachusetts in particular, in around 1853, 1854. And it started as a secret society, but then became a political party. And the Massachusetts establishment hated it for very good reasons. One Whig, a guy named Lincoln, actually, no relation to the famous Lincoln, the great Lincoln, referred to these people as the various race of spaniel ministers, lying tooth pullers, and bargaining priests that were ever showered upon an unoffending people. But Wilson noted that they were hostile to the bigwigs of industry, which he liked a lot. They were promoters of workers' rights. Again, that was right down his alley. They believed in women's suffrage. They were generally, not passionately, but generally anti-slavery. And he figured, I can do business with these people. So he entered into conversations with a guy named Henry Gardner. Henry Gardner was a leader of the Know Nothings in Massachusetts. And Henry Wilson had announced that he was going to run for governor on the free soil ticket. And but Gardner said, listen, I'm going to run for governor, but that's fine. You can run too. I'm so confident that this wave of sentiment washing over Massachusetts is going to carry me in the governorship that I don't have to worry about whether you're running or not. So if you want to run, go ahead and run. And Wilson immediately said, no, I'm getting out. I'm going to give you all my support. But I've got something else I'm interested in from this negotiation. And that something else was, if the Know Nothings got control of the legislature and if Gardner got control of the governorship, he wanted to become the next senator from Massachusetts in the United States Senate. And that's exactly what happened. Now, here's a spoiler alert. So I had never heard of Henry Wilson before, and maybe you haven't either. But here's what he went on to do. He served 18 years in the United States Senate. He was, during the Civil War, he was chairman of the Military Affairs Committee, and he became very close to Lincoln and offered him a lot of advice on military matters, which Lincoln avidly accepted. And then he became vice president of the United States under Ulysses Grant, all without a trace in history. Now we have to look at South Carolina. And if the first settlers of Massachusetts came for religious freedom, and David Hackett, I'm having a mental block here, David Hackett Fisher, the great historian of the immigration of America, says that the Puritans came for one reason and one reason only, for religious freedom. The settlers of South Carolina came for another purpose entirely, to get rich. I actually said they came with two things in mind, to get rich and then to get richer. And they were men of swagger. Many of them came up eventually, ultimately, enough of them came up to sort of get control of the political culture of South Carolina from Barbados and other West Indies islands. And they brought with them a business model that had been very successful and had generated huge profits in the islands. Business model was plantation economy, producing staple crops with slave labor for world markets. And it worked for them in the islands, and mostly second sons who, because of primogeniture, were not able to inherit anything. So they were told, go to South Carolina and take these slaves with you and get yourself into that tremendous money-making enterprise. So in succession, they produced sugar, indigo, rice, and cotton. Cotton, the great high margin crop. And I don't have time for purposes of this discussion to go into very many of the people from South Carolina, but I'm going to talk a little bit about two. One was, both of them became senators from South Carolina, one of them for a long time. Andrew Pickens Butler and Robert Barnwell Rhett. So we have a Rhett and a Butler, but no Rhett Butler, and no Scarlett O'Hara, as far as I know. Butler came from a family that was part of the South Carolina aristocracy for generations. He was a big man with a massive face and a flow of white hair that one contemporary journalist described as contending with the blasts of winter. His most pronounced trait was a penchant for quips and jokes. He could diffuse any heated confrontation, and he always did, with bonhomie and good humor. And as a result of that, he was very popular. But he was a fervent defender of the Southern way of life, which meant, of course, he was a fervent defender of slavery, which he thought was an underpinning of civilization. He was not eloquent like Sumner at all, but he spoke with a kind of an arresting bluster, and he was given to lively colloquialisms. And he liked to go to Charles Sumner. They actually became very good friends initially when Sumner came to the Senate, because Butler loved to get some of Sumner's erudition so he could sprinkle some of his allusions, classical allusions and references into his speeches. He was very influential as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he had close ties to other powerful figures in the Senate, particularly, of course, from the South. Now we got to turn to Barnwell Rhett, who was christened Robert Barnwell Smith, but he changed it at age 31 because he thought that Smith was kind of a not a very bold name and kind of a common name, and so he got rid of it and harked back to some earlier members of his heritage, the Rhetts. He entered the planter class by marriage. His family was not well-to-do. Pardon me. And went to the U.S. Congress and served there for 12 years as a protege of John C. Calhoun. There were really two sides of the man. The good side was that he was a man of culture. He was a courtly gentleman, especially in his dealings with women and children. And he was known for his personal rectitude. But also, the bad side, he was very mercurial. He could be extremely feisty. He was a political radical of the first order, and his harsh rhetoric. John Quincy Adams, who was distantly related to him through his mother, Abigail Adams, who had been a Smith, the same name as Rhett. He said that Rhett often sounded like a howling dog, and much of his howling concerned what he considered to be a South Carolina imperative: get out of the Union while there was still time. So he was quoted as these most outlandish statements. I see but one course left for the peace and salvation of the South, the dissolution of the Union. And he didn't just say that in a moment of anger on the floor like other Southerners did, but he said it sort of constantly like it's what he really believed. And when it was suggested that was really kind of treasonous, what he was saying, because he was really saying that we should break up this regime. He said, "Let it be that I'm a traitor. The word has no terrors for me." He said that he had ancestors that had been traitors, and he was just glad that they were traitors in the cause of liberty. And he added that Adams and Henry and Jefferson and Rutledge were all disunionists, all traitors. And he was elected to the Senate by the South Carolina legislature in 1850. In 1850, there was a secession crisis in America that emerged, and it was very powerful. And then it sort of receded as a result of the Compromise of 1850, which we don't have time to get into. But when Rhett was elected to the Senate, it was viewed as a sign that South Carolina was ready to secede from the Union. But the state split into two factions: the secessionists, who were followers of Rhett, they were ready to go, even if no other state in the Union was willing to join them in this dangerous exit from the Union. And the other side were the cooperationists. They were ready to go too, but they only wanted to go if they only were willing to go if other states would join them, so there would be enough of a body to create another country. And the cooperationists didn't think that South Carolina, standing alone, could possibly be fortified enough to withstand the pressures that would come from the federal government. Not necessarily, and the great cooperationist was Butler, was Pickens Butler. And he didn't suggest that the North would come down with military troops, but they could, he said. But he knew that they would wage an economic war against South Carolina and blockade their Charleston Harbor and destroy their economy, which they probably would have. So the debate came to a head with a vote for South Carolina delegates to a convention, a southern-wide convention that was going to take place the following year in 1852 in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. And the vote, whether the secessionists gained more of the delegates or the cooperationists did, was considered to be a coming bellwether in terms of where the state was on the issue. And it was assumed that the secessionists were going to win essentially that referendum. But the opposite happened. The cooperationists won. And South Carolina then entered into almost a strange period of sort of political drift. They were in a state of suspended animation in which they said, we're in favor of secession, but only in condition that things emerge in a way that they're not going to emerge. So the state couldn't figure out what it was going to do in terms of this crisis. And it percolated along that way for a long time through the 1850s. Now, Pickens Butler picked up a lot of political stature because he had accurately sized up where the state was on that referendum. But Barnwell Rhett lost a lot of stature. In fact, he was essentially hounded out of the Senate. At one political meeting, he wasn't on the agenda to speak as a senator, but it was suggested maybe they should ask him to come and speak. And the consensus among the people, the political people at that meeting, was no, we don't want to hear what he has to say. It was quite a humiliation. And he resigned his seat on April 30, 1852, and left the office 7 years later. Now, I don't want to leave an impression here that this book is just about Massachusetts and South Carolina. The whole concept was to use the political figures, the major political figures of those two states, and the political machinations as those two states were adjusting and responding to the big events that were going on at the national level, to sort of give life to the narrative. So the book tells the full story of the nation as it grappled with that profound issue over the course of almost 11 years. So there are profiles of the presidents of 1850. It's not a statesman in the lot until Lincoln comes, and it's not even clear what Lincoln was going to do. And later, it gets into the national figures, William Seward, David Atchison, Stephen A. Douglas. I got to tell you an anecdote about Stephen Douglas. Thomas Hart Benton, the great senator from Missouri, 30 years in the Senate, starting in 1820 to 1850. And Stephen A. Douglas, of course, was a 5'4", very squat, big, wide shoulders. He looked like a block of wood with another smaller block of wood on top as his head. But inside that head was a hell of a mind. But Thomas Hart Benton didn't like him very much and disagreed with him most of the time. But he found him very elusive as a target. And he said, in his orotund way of speaking, he said, "The man will not do, sir. The man will not do, sir. His legs are too short, sir. That part of the anatomy that one might wish to kick is too near the ground." And it goes into, obviously, the big events that occurred as the country struggled to settle this intractable issue without violence and without war, unsuccessfully as it turned out. So that's my sort of little smattering of what's in the book, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. I'd welcome them. Thank you.
Mr. Mary, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Nathan Weissler, and I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm ultimately hoping to teach American history with a focus on the history of slavery and civil rights. And as I was reading your book, one story that struck me as particularly important is the story of Anthony Burns, and the immense controversy that erupted over his forced return to slavery from Boston. I was wondering if you would be able to speak some about Anthony Burns, and what did you find to be particularly important about him as you were doing your research?
Well, he was very important, and especially in Massachusetts, and he was part of a broader controversy that enveloped Massachusetts after the 1850 Compromise, which included a bill, the Fugitive Slave Act, which put greater onus and requirement on northern states to apprehend and return runaway slaves to their masters. And Anthony Burns was one, but I can't think of his first name, but Mickens was an earlier one, and they managed to spirit him away when the slave catchers were circling around trying to get him. And but the president, even the president of the United States, Franklin Pierce, got involved and said, "We're not going to let that happen again." And so they made sure that Anthony Burns could not get away. And it's very dramatic. I'm rather proud of that chapter because there was some really wonderful material about all this that was in the newspapers of Boston as it was unfolding. And the dramatic episode where Burns was basically marched through the streets of Boston. They had a military escort because they were afraid that there would be some violence. And there was violence in which there was efforts to free Burns. And he ended up, a person ended up being killed. So very, very dramatic and a significant development in terms of exacerbating these pet passions and tensions that were roiling the nation.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I feel like I should know the answer to this question. It's kind of a what-if question, maybe outside of the scope of your book, but what if they had not seceded from the Union? Was there an existential threat that gave them no option, or did they take a step that wasn't? What if the status quo had stayed the same and they had not seceded?
The status quo was not tenable from the Southern point of view because here's what was happening, and it really came into focus with the Kansas violence and bleeding Kansas. That Missouri was there were only 10% of the population of Missouri were slaves, so it didn't have the same political power that a Mississippi or Alabama would have, and Missouri would go free if would turn against slavery, and the South was afraid that would set in motion a kind of a chain reaction. And meanwhile, the North was gaining increasing power vis-a-vis the South in economic power, demographic power, and just generally greater wealth and everything else. And they saw that the North was going to basically end slavery at some point, and they were right about that. And they desperately, it was all their way of life. They made a pact with the devil, as I point out, when they first came. And they were fighting that and struggling with that ever since. And they couldn't get out from under it.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Okay. Whenever people talk about the characters of this time, and even today when we talk about the influence of millionaires and billionaires in political life, I'm always reminded of Garrett Smith, who was perhaps the most radical person in America. At the same time, he was the most wealthy person in the country.
He was immensely wealthy. He was a New Yorker, but he was very close to the Massachusetts abolitionists and the people that were known as the Secret Six. The Secret Six were a group of very prominent Massachusetts people who were supporters of John Brown, even after they realized that what John Brown was going to do at Harpers Ferry. And Garrett Smith was one of them. Garrett Smith, though, is kind of often he would go back and forth. He didn't always have the courage of his convictions. And he was once described, let me see if I can remember how this was, that he was a strong advocate of any action in this anti-slavery cause until that action began to look dangerous or something like that. And but nevertheless, he was one of the Secret Six, and he was very, very stalwart in his anti-slavery sentiments.
Even supported referendums, as I remember.
He did.
In southern states.
Yeah, which is courageous. He didn't go down there, but he did. Yes, sir.
Well, I'd like to ask another what-if question. It kind of pairs up, actually, with the previous question about what might have happened if the South just tried to live with the status quo and didn't secede. My question is, what do you think would have happened if the North had decided that the way they wanted to handle the situation was through economic means, maybe blockading of ports and so forth, but to kind of refrain from outright military, ground-based military action and so forth with the South? Would the South have not sort of accepted that and invaded the North, or what would have happened?
It wasn't an option for Lincoln. It might have been an option for Buchanan had he run again and won, which he couldn't have done. But it wasn't an option for Lincoln. When the South began to seize federal property, that was treason. Mm-hmm. And the President of the United States, who makes a solemn oath, and Lincoln made this mention in his was it acceptance speech or his inaugural, which he made mention of the fact that these people did not swear an oath to break up the Union, but he swore an oath to keep the Union, to preserve and protect the Union. So he didn't really have that option, and a lot of people have suggested that he did, or that there were other ways of handling it. I'm not sure that in the way things unfolded, there was any other way for them to unfold.
So Lincoln was the key person in any case as far as the answer to the
ultimately
question.
And it's fair to remember that Lincoln really tried to compromise this thing. When he was running for president, he accepted slavery where it existed. Garrison drove Garrison crazy. Garrison's friend that I mentioned earlier called him that. I can't remember what he called him, but it was very dismissive. Pardon? Slave hound from Illinois. Very good. Yes, slave hound. So he suggested that he wasn't going to touch slavery where it existed. He wasn't going to. He said that this Fugitive Slave Act was mandated by the Constitution, which there was language in the Constitution about it. He said that he would favor eliminating slavery in the District of Columbia, but only if the people in the District of Columbia had an opportunity to vote on it, which meant that it would not pass. And he even said that he was not in favor of social integration of the races. None of it worked. I mean, he gave up a lot, but he did not give up. He would not give up no extension of slavery, because he said, as he sent to his friends, the rub has to come, and because if it doesn't, if we finesse it, we try to finesse it, then it's never going to go away. The rub has to come, and the rub led to war.
In your research, did you turn up any research about Southern Unionists, or South Carolina Unionists rather, or anti-secession folks throughout the 1850s, or sort of Southern or secession sympathizers in Massachusetts during the same period, and what their interactions were with the people you profiled?
Yeah. There were some, a guy named Perry and a guy named Orr, both of them were members of Congress, and they developed a political philosophy that they thought was pertinent to this ordeal of South Carolina, which was that they only had two options if they wanted to preserve their way of life: secede or accept that they wouldn't be able to preserve their way of life. So he thought that what was needed was for South Carolina to sort of break away from the control of the oligarchs, the people that basically owned South Carolina politics, and they were the low country planters, and they were very, very wealthy, and they dominated South Carolina politics. Bust away from those people and get into manufacturing, get into modern economic activity, so that we can compete with the North on an equal footing. And that was Perry and Orr, and they were influential during that period of time when things were in a sort of a state of suspended animation, but ultimately they couldn't prevail.
Thank you.
Anything else? Oh, yes. Do I know you, sir?
How you doing, Bob?
I'm good. I'm good.
Reading your book and all the other literature on the war, you're struck by the inevitability of the war. One of your previous books. Thank you. One of your previous books is about Polk and the Mexican War, which was obviously was a big event in that coming of the war. Was there any time or any circumstance where the war might have been avoided? I mean, is the inevitability that we see from our point of view, was that true? Was it was there no way that the war could have been avoided?
I don't think so. You can't, you can't answer a question like that definitively. But I don't see how, actually. And when you look at when the Wilmot Proviso emerged during the Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, which basically said no slaves can go into any of the territory that we might accumulate through this war. It was in the middle of the war. The South went crazy. And between that point, from about 1847 to 1850, and the South was agitating in such a intense way that it seemed that some kind of war or some kind of split was almost inevitable. And I begin the book with a chapter, Jim, you may recall this, which is kind of interesting and kind of has a parallel to today in a way. In December of 1849, the Congress congregated, the new Congress, the 29th Congress, I think, congregated to begin the session. It was the 31st, maybe, I'm not sure. But anyway, and they couldn't elect a speaker because the Whigs and the Democrats were in such parity, and the Free Soilers had the balance of power if they wanted to play, but they didn't want to play. They refused to involve themselves in that kind of politics. And so they couldn't elect a speaker for 3 weeks. And it was like a terrible crisis, and people said this is not the way the country's supposed to be. Well, it happened twice more through the 1850s. And in both of those cases, it lasted 2 months, where Congress essentially froze up because they couldn't elect a speaker. And if they couldn't elect a speaker, the House couldn't begin doing anything. The Senate couldn't, and the president couldn't send up his annual message because nobody was there to read it. But if you go back and look at that 1849 episode, the language and the rhetoric was from the South particularly, and which was angry and challenging, and from the North it was almost dismissive and jocular. You guys say you're going to go. I don't. What are you going to do? Yeah, I don't see you doing anything about it. And then the 1850 Compromise came through when Henry Clay came out of retirement. He'd been in retirement for 8 years. He had tuberculosis, but he didn't know it. And he comes up to the new Congress with the idea of formulating a compromise. But the problem with that, now, he didn't realize that when he formulated the Great Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, it was basically designed to maintain a parity of power between the slave states and the free states, which suggested that the aim was to manage this issue until slavery could basically fade away on its own. But that basically implied that slavery was going to continue until some unspecified date into the future, right? That worked in 1820. It didn't work in 1850 because the idea that there was going to be slavery was just ongoing, was just totally unacceptable, increasingly with increasing power in the North, and the South was getting increasingly agitated as a result of the threat that they perceived from Northern power.
Well, we know that the founding fathers hoped that slavery would just die away because they couldn't get rid of it and get the Constitution. Do you think they really believed that could happen, or was that just wishful thinking?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to get into their heads. But the question was, the founding fathers, it is said pretty widely that they expected slavery to fade away on its own, and that therefore they didn't castigate themselves for accepting its ongoing reality into the future. And did they really believe that? Probably some did, and probably some didn't. Maybe they were fooling themselves. But it wasn't. It was. The other interesting thing is what I learned and I didn't know about was that until about the 1830s, there were anti-slavery societies. Pertinent to this previous question, there were anti-slavery societies in the South because there were people in the South who had the courage to step forward, and they weren't hounded or abused for doing so. But after 1830 or so, when the Garrison and others began to agitate more powerfully, that was shut down. Yes.
This one may have a little resonance with today. Do you think it was in the economic interests of a majority of South Carolinians or a majority of Southerners, setting aside even slaves at the time, in the economic interest for slavery to persist or for secession at least to occur? I'm trying to get a sense of what the political will was across the whole electorate, across the population for seceding, and whether they were justified in any sense from an economic welfare point of view.
Well, this gentleman, Orr and Perry, were heroes to the non-slaveholding whites of South Carolina, because they were the yeoman class was basically put down by the Bourbons, right? And so there was that influence. But the fact of the matter is that these people, South Carolina was sort of the first great example. These people built a whole way of life on slave labor, on the evil of slave labor, and they couldn't get rid of it. Their whole way of life, their philosophy, their thinking, their economics, their wealth generation, everything was all embedded in so you couldn't pull slavery out of it without basically destroying it, which we knew, we learned from what happened in the war. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming.